What's up, guys? I'm Zano from Jito. I've been in the space as an engineer for a couple of years now. Really got into it because DeFi is just amazing. I think financial sovereignty is just, it's an amazing concept. I've been working on Jito for the last 3 years. We build MEV software and along with a couple other things on Solana. And yeah, I mean, it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? I'll introduce myself. I'm Ben. So my background's all in very in the weeds, computer science, mathematics, high performance computing style stuff. We studied math and CS in school for a few years, interned at 2 high frequency trading firms, Acuna Capital and Citadel Securities. Became really fascinated by trading and market structure and stuff like that. But at the same time, I was doing a lot of research on blockchain systems and just high performance distributed systems in general. Became very interested in the intersection between the two. And as we'll get into, MEV considerations are very, very relevant to that. And yeah, excited to chat a little bit more. Well, WTF is MEV.
Yeah, what is it? What is MEV? Seriously, everybody's throwing this around. This obscure, mysterious acronym. What is MEV to you, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. MEV is sort of this intrinsic property of blockchains that is essentially the concept that in blockchains where you rotate proposers, such as Solana or Ethereum, you've got time windows where proposers have a lot of power. They have the sole power to actually build and produce a block. And in the process of actually building a block, there's a lot of value that you can actually capture in doing so, right? So, one of the most infamous examples is, say you've got an NFT mint, for example, and it just so happens that in Solana, for example, my leader slot is the leader slot where that NFT mint actually starts. I am in the ultimate position to actually capture every single NFT. When that mint goes live, I can just snap them all up, just like that, right? There's many other types of MEV related to markets and stuff like that, but yeah, we can get into that a little more. I just wanted to ask you, what are kind of your overall thoughts on MEV, right? A lot of people see it in a negative light. Is it necessarily a bad thing? Can we get rid of it, or should we?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I see this get thrown around a lot. Let's remove MEV. I think that comes from a good place. I don't think MEV is necessarily a malicious phenomenon. I think it's a naturally occurring property of blockchains and any system that requires consensus on the sequencing of events as they happen. I think I think it comes from a great place, right? That sort of let's get rid of MEV. I think the way you need to think about it is, how do we give users the best pricing, and how do we optimize for the best user experience? And what I think is good user experience is, an example is just, I push a trade out to the network and I don't get filled at the worst price possible. And worst price possible is, let's say you put 5% slippage and you get filled at 5% slippage when you could have gotten filled at 0.1% slippage. I think in order to be competitive or harmoniously competitive with centralized exchanges, we need to do just as well as centralized exchanges. Today we're seeing about $500 million in MEV generated for the network on Solana. It's a big number, but I think it's actually quite a small number in the grand scheme of things. Over the next decade, I expect this to be a multi-billion-dollar sector in DeFi. What do you think, Ben? We're at $500 million today. What's the state of MEV on Solana? How would you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I do get the feeling we're going to go higher. 500 million is still a lot, and if I'm not mistaken, that's value that's been captured by Jito alone, right? And this is a lower bound on how much MEV is actually in Solana to begin with, right? And I get the feeling that, especially with all the exciting announcements and all the users that will continue to try Solana, that this number is probably going to go a lot higher, right? So what we're seeing right now is that you got, like in Solana, for example, the users will send transactions directly to the validators, to their TPU, right? And one thing that we're seeing right now, right, is the validators have realized that the information that the users actually send them is pretty valuable, right? It's like a transaction that hits the TPU but actually hasn't landed on the chain yet.
Right.
Validators will sometimes pass this information down to, we'll say, searchers. They're essentially people that bid on these MEV opportunities and compete to return the most value to validators and stakers as possible, right?
Is this, so what you're describing here, how do you see it? Is this malicious or how do you describe that?
Yeah, so like, there's some types of MEV that I could definitely describe as more more native MEV, such as front running, for example, right?
Okay.
And sandwiching's the really infamous one that people talk about a lot, right? This is when I'll have a user send me a transaction, right? And I'm going to pass this transaction. I'm going to pass this transaction on to searchers, right? Or maybe I'll just I will insert my own front run transaction before that retail transaction, right? Insert the retail transaction, right, and then dump on them. But essentially I am ensuring that the user gets the worst price possible, right? And I would call this a negative type of MEV because the validator is behaving in a way that ultimately results in the user getting the absolute worst price possible in the market, right? So I think the one thing that I wanted to touch on next is, as a staker, this is probably something that you want to be aware of, right? You'll have some validators that will just consistently engage in behavior of leaking retail flow to sandwichers, right? And then you'll have some validators that might be actually trying to keep that flow private and actually give users better prices, right? So, I'm not sure who coined this exact phrase, but something I've heard thrown around quite a bit is that staking is explicitly political, right? In a way that, say, like Bitcoin or like a proof of work network is not.
Yep.
And what do I mean by this, right? And like how am I as a staker, how might I actually help mitigate this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sherwani coined the term. I'll give him credit because he's good at just coining new phrases. But yeah, POS networks are explicitly political. I think the way I interpret that, well, scooting back, I think proof of work networks and any sort of system where you can influence large groups of people through incentives to act in certain ways are going to naturally be political. POS networks have manifested out to be even more political. The way I interpret it is you have some capital as an individual and you direct that capital to validators. By doing so, you give that validator power over the network to propose blocks. You were talking about proposing blocks earlier. We were talking about sequencing of events. At every slot, on Solana, slots are just units of time. Every unit of time, there is a single arbiter of transaction ordering, and that is proportional explicitly to your amount of stake or delegations that you have. So as a staker, if you believe that certain activities are malicious, then you should not stake to validators or stake pools that allow that specific type of activity. That's where it gets political, right? And then you might be a staker that doesn't care. You just want to optimize for yield. That's fine. Everybody, that's the beauty about these networks is whether or not we think things are malicious, they are open networks. And if you cannot mitigate something through cryptography or incentives, then so be it. That's the problems that we're trying to figure out here. Those are the problems that teams like mine and yours are trying to solve here. I think stake pools help with this problem a bit. As a staker, you probably don't have the know-how. As an individual, retail user, you probably don't want to be monitoring your validator that you stake to. Did this validator rug me on the yield? Did this validator, right at the end of the epoch, crank the commission up to 100%? Or did this validator sandwich users where I'm against that sort of activity? What you do is you offload the task of monitoring validators to stake pools. And stake pools are aligned with, stake pools only spread stake around validators that are explicitly aligned with them. Some stake pools optimize for yields, some stake pools optimize for other things, right? So as a staker, you should be staking to stake pools. Stake pools will then take on the burden of monitoring the validators. Why do you think it's important that stakers think about what they're staking to, who they're staking to, and whether or not they're aligned? Why is that important?
Right, yeah. I can I'll make an argument to every staker in this room, and I can make this argument to every staker on Solana that if you're trying to actually ensure long-term prosperity on the network, you actually want to engage in behavior that benefits your users, because users are the customers of the network, right? Users bring value to the network. They pay fees to the network to execute their transactions. Those fees ultimately accrue to stakers, right? So as a staker, you want the maximal number of users on the network long term. And as a staker, if you're staking to validators that are just leaking transactions and sandwiching users left and right, you're probably going to drive those users away from the network.
Right.
Like if I'm a retail trader, for example, I'm sending orders on Solana, and I am always getting filled at literally the worst price I could get filled at. That is the very definition of an inefficient market, right? And especially in the short to medium term, what we really want to see is stakers and validators in the greater Solana community to actually work together, figure out why so many users, are getting sandwiched, and figure out how we can put a stop to it, right? And that starts by, again, like stakers need to know their validators. They need to have a relationship with them, right? They need to actually be vigilant. And as a Solana developer community, right, I have a feeling that people are going to put out a lot of tooling relatively soon that's hopefully going to give us a lot more insight into which validators are behaving maliciously, leaking user transactions, which eventually leads to those users being front run, right? Now, this is kind of short to medium term. I think there's some more things that we can do in the long term. What have you heard, for example?
I mean, there's many proposals out there. There's a multi-concurrent proposal stuff. I think that's super interesting. I'm the one that interests me the most is async execution. I think Solana was the reason why I got Solana pilled, and I think a lot of people got Solana pilled, whether you know it or not, is because Solana's block propagation through Turbine is the blocks get streamed out as opposed to a validator building an entire block and then posting it out once the block's built. I think that was a step function improvement over previous networks, and I think the next improvement is going to be async execution, where consensus essentially gets faster. I think that in combination with multiple concurrent proposers helps with a lot of things we're talking about here. And I just want to know, we've been talking a lot about sort of like the malicious things and things like that. But like on a more positive note, I think Solana's got some of the best validator operators in the ecosystem or across crypto, period. I've been in the room with, I've been in the war room with some of these guys, and I'm sure you have too, where, we've had outages and that sucks. But when you can coordinate people across seas and oceans to, coordinate restarts. You got people in Europe where it's 5 a.m. their time, people in the US, everybody just coordinates together, and we're pushing out patches. Like, you don't see that. I don't see that in any other ecosystem. So, I mean, kudos to those guys, and honestly, just wanted to highlight that. I'm pretty optimistic. What do you think? What's going to happen in the future? How do you see the next decade or two playing out?
Yeah. So I think, and also to kind of continue what you said, I think that these are the fact that some validators are behaving maliciously and maybe even some stakers. This is a conscious trade-off of decentralization, right? In TradFi and in the centralized world, we solve a lot of these problems with things like law and regulation. Say, if you are front-running people on your own exchange, that is definitely illegal in almost every jurisdiction, right? Part of the value proposition of decentralized networks is, can we actually solve these problems without having to trust anyone, right? And I'm pretty involved in the core community and in a lot of the core stuff that's happening. And we're working on a lot of solutions that will hopefully solve these problems longer term, right? Because even if stakers, and I think it's really important for stakers to be extremely vigilant about who they stake and to know their validators and, again, to keep in touch, make sure their validators aren't behaving maliciously, right? But beyond that, we're working on a lot at the core L1 level to actually solve these problems longer term, right? There's a few proposals that are floating around, and discussions as to which proposal is the best is ongoing, right? So the first thing you need can actually be solved at the application layer. You actually just need better DEXs, like better DEX mechanism design, right? Like I think XY equals K kind of creates this fundamentally flawed market structure, right? Where it's really, really easy to atomically front run and then back run someone. What you actually want are DEXs more like order books or auction mechanisms or RFQs or something like that, where you can actually have multiple people that are competing to give users the best price possible, right? Now where this breaks down is if the L1 is not censorship resistant, and that's where multiple concurrent proposers, for example, helps a lot. Another thing that I've heard thrown around a lot, and I know like the Firedancer team is a really big proponent of this. They think that we can get slot times down to like 20 milliseconds or even lower than that.
Sheesh.
Like if we actually get slot times that fast, we get a really, really high degree of censorship resistance as well. And I think some combination of lowering slot times and hopefully in the future figuring out a mechanism that, at least in my opinion, I like multiple concurrent proposers a lot. In my opinion, I think there's a way that we can get this on Solana long term as well. And this will enable a market structure that I think is a lot friendlier toward users and that can, I think, be maximally competitive with centralized exchanges long term.
Ben, you're an absolute gigabrain. I hope everyone in the ecosystem continues doing what they're doing and we continue working together to solve these hard problems. Yeah, my final thoughts are just higher. I think we just go extremely high. That's it. Thank you.
Appreciate the compliment, and thank you. I'm not the only one.